the point about Wisconsin is, and it is absolutely true, that this last process in 2011 was the most hyper-partisan redistricting process that we have seen in the state, I think, ever. It used to be, and one of the reasons was that for the last 50 years, there has been some form of divided government in Wisconsin where either the legislature or one house of the legislature was one party and the governor another. So ultimately, there would be something of a compromise every 10 years when they redistricted the state, and then it would go to the federal court, and then there would be some changes, but by and large, the changes weren't as drastic or as horrific as we saw in Wisconsin in 2011, when it was one party control of everything. And as Fred mentioned, it was done totally out of the public eye. It was done in a law office across the street from the Capitol, and Republican legislators had to sign secrecy oaths in order to go see the map that had been drawn for them by the legislative leadership and the lawyers at this law firm. Michael Best and Friedrich, by the way, is the name of the law firm, if you ever want to know the law firm not to use. But nevertheless, and the result, as Fred mentioned, was horrendous. And from my standpoint, which is not a partisan standpoint, it was particularly awful because what it did was it reduced the number of competitive general elections from about 26% in 2010 before redistricting to, in 2014, less than 10% of the 132 legislative districts. That's 99 assembly, 33 state senate, actually 16 state senate seats were up in 2014. But less than 10% were competitive in the general election. By competitive, we mean 55 to 45% or less. So all 90%, you had results if there was a contested election, which fell outside of that. And what that means, of course, is that there's virtually no change, regardless of what the overall vote for the Democrats is, because of the packed Democrats into districts. By the way, the Republicans are less packed, but they intend to depend on the changes in the campaign finance law to help them. Unlimited outside corporate money to aid their candidates to make sure that they're elected. So this is all part of a grander plan. But nevertheless, the legislation that virtually everybody who favors campaign finance reform, with a couple of notable exceptions, have rallied around is to adopt a plan they have in Iowa. And the Iowa plan is where you have the Legislative Service Bureau, which in Wisconsin would be the Legislative Reference Bureau, actually draw the lines. And then the legislature can vote up or down on the lines. But the lines are drawn with a pretty strict criteria, one of which is that it's nice to keep cities together and towns together. Squares are good, lizards not as good. Counties, keeping them intact, communities of interest intact. And by the way, the past partisan performance of the district, nor the hometown of the legislator, is taken into account when the Legislative Service Bureau in Iowa draws the lines. And the reason that I think that's a better choice for Wisconsin at this time, unless this lawsuit, which has promise, is passed and implemented, which would be fantastic, by the way. But if it isn't, then it's a better fit because A, in order to change the process in Wisconsin to an independent commission made of citizens rather than keeping it under control of the legislature would require a constitutional amendment, which, as you know, in Wisconsin is very difficult. It takes passage in 2 separate sessions of the legislature and then ratification by the people. I don't have any questions if the people would ratify it, but to get this legislature to ratify it in 1 session of the legislature, let alone 2, I think is a long shot, to say the least. But the second reason is that Iowa, for many reasons, is a good fit for Wisconsin because we're sort of similar. We're different demographically. It's true. There's a larger minority population, believe it or not, in Wisconsin, and we have one of the smallest minority populations in the country.
but it's even smaller in Iowa, and there is more packed density of partisans in Wisconsin than there is in Iowa. But the other reason too is that it does give the legislature still the control to pass it up or down without amending it. And that's important because it would conceivably have a smoother ride to get through here in Wisconsin than it would in Iowa. So one of the reasons is practical. The other reason is it's what the reform community and reform-minded legislators, by and large, rallied around. Senator Tim Cullen, ex-Senator Tim Cullen, Democrat of Janesville, Dale Schultz, ex-Republican from Richland Center, and Senator Hansen, who's still in Green Bay, who's still in the legislature, were the main Senate people behind this. Cullen and Schultz have actually joined the lawsuit that Fred is working on. So it's not like we're divided. It's just sort of a different kind of emphasis right now. And I could be persuaded to go in a different direction, particularly if this lawsuit passes. But the thing about it, and the thing you should keep in mind, is that Robin Vos and Scott Fitzgerald have refused not just to consider the legislation, the Iowa legislation, but to even have a public hearing on it. They refuse even to schedule a public hearing because they know that there's a lot of logic, it makes a lot of sense, and that it would resonate with a lot of people. So there have been several alternative public hearings that have been held over the years. And I'm happy to tell you that every daily newspaper in Wisconsin, 19 daily newspapers, have endorsed this legislation, are calling on the legislature to call on the leaders to hold a public hearing on it. And I do think one of the great values of it is it does provide an opportunity for us to go before forums like this and educate you about there is a different way. There is another way that you could have your members of Congress and your legislature at least selected initially so that you would have a real choice in the November election. Most districts in this state, by the way, when I moved to Wisconsin in 1988, there were 6 competitive congressional districts. Today, 0. Not a single one is competitive. The last one was the 8th district in Green Bay, the Fox Valley, but really that's not even as a result of 2011 competitive anymore. So every member of Congress has a safe seat. Jim Sensenbrenner, as you know, has had for years, but everyone does. And only 10% of the state legislative districts are even remotely competitive during the general election. What does that mean? It means that elections are decided in the primaries, and in the primaries, the more extremes tend to win out. And that's certainly true in the Republican Party, that the far more conservative right candidates are the ones that prevail in the primaries because there's less turnout, and the true believers turn out in the primaries as opposed to the general election. And that's why guys like Dale Schultz are out of here. He was faced with a primary in 2014 from a more conservative candidate who was promised hundreds of thousands of dollars by outside groups. So Schultz is gone. Mike Ellis of Neenah likely would have been primaried. In fact, he was driven out of re-election by a right-wing group who filmed him in a bar after he'd had a couple of cocktails, talking as only Mike Ellis can talk about, something that wasn't even real, but something that he had in mind, and that was used against him. But the moderates of the Republican Party have been driven out slowly. Some of the Democratic moderates have been too, to be honest with you. There are challenges from the left. And you may think that's a good thing, but what is lost when you drive the moderates out of both parties is polarization in the legislature and the failure to come together on almost anything. That's certainly evident in the Congress and has been for a number of years, but it's more and more evident in the legislature to the extent, and Frank can tell you, the Republicans and Democrats aren't even allowed to have lunch together anymore, for Christ's sake. They're not allowed to have a beer together because their leaders tell them they can't do that. And that's ridiculous, because that's not the Wisconsin way. That's not how we used to conduct state government. So those are the real reasons I think we need to have redistricting reform. The greatest reason is that, as Fred alluded to, you have a more responsive legislator, regardless of party, if there is some fear in their heart and in their soul that they could lose an election. And so they have to listen to their constituents. They have to talk to them. That's not to suggest that Fred Kessler doesn't listen to his constituents and is not responsive, but there would be far more responsiveness on the part of legislators of all political parties if there was more competition in the system. But ultimately, we agree on the solution, which has to be a nonpartisan redistricting reform. And here's the great news. The great news is that more and more people get this than did just 2 years ago. I would go to rooms and people would stare at me, often fall asleep, when you started talking about gerrymandering and redistricting. Now people understand it's sort of the fundamental building block of democracy, and it's where everything else has to start. So with that, I guess I'll go back to Fred, and then hopefully we'll get to hear some things from you.
Well, we're about to hear Mary Batari, but
Oh, she's
before we